PHP itself is actually very similar to JavaScript. So learning it really won't be that big of an extension away from JavaScript. The trickiest thing about PHP really is learning how to debug it and where to find your answers when things go wrong. We've been used to doing it in the browser because the browser runs our JavaScript. That won't happen in PHP. PHP itself actually used to stand for Personal Home Page. That was the original acronym when it was created a very long time ago. That's really become obsolete, and now they say it stands for PHP Hypertext Preprocessor, which is incidentally a recursive acronym, which is something that computer nerds like to do anymore. But that's what it technically stands for now. So initially here, we're just going to learn some of the simplest stuff and try and do something significant with it, which, as I often like to do, will be creating a table. A table involves a lot of repetitive things and a lot of decisions, so you get to use a lot of the basics of programming when you do tables. So, to begin with, let's talk about variables. This is always where things start. A variable always needs to start with the $ character. You can think of this as being equivalent to the var that you'd normally put at the beginning of a variable in JavaScript. So just make sure you start with a $ character. It'll know it's a variable. That $ character is actually part of its name, so you use it when you first assign to it, and you use it later on when you're referring to the variable. This is simply how it knows it's a variable and how it can refer to it later on. The types are pretty much as you'd expect. There are a few more than we had in JavaScript, but the basic ones we do have. You've got string, you've got booleans, and you've got the array. You also have numbers, but this time they can truly be integers or floating point values. This means that there isn't just one single type for numbers. If you use it and it always stores integers, PHP is smart. It'll recognize that and it will store it under the hood as a genuine integer. As soon as you exceed what an integer can do, it switches it to a float type. Or if you initially just store something that has a decimal value on it, it will store it as a float. This generally doesn't change the way you treat them, but it is important to note that they are two distinct types now, and you can wind up with one or the other depending on how you use your numbers. So like I said, it picks the best based on what value you assign to it. Just like with JavaScript, we're never going to say what the types are explicitly. It's always going to pick for you, and it's going to use dynamic typing. If you want to know what the type is, you can examine that with the function vardump. So you call that function and you pass it the variable. It will output both its value and its type together. So you can see a lot about a value by using that. Vardump can actually be really useful when you're dealing with arrays and objects as well. Arrays work exactly the same way as they do in JavaScript. Now, the one caution I have is that that's only if you're using PHP version 5.4 or later. If you aren't, you have to do arrays a little bit differently. The syntax was a little different, and I would imagine they probably updated it in 5.4 in order to match JavaScript, since the two are used together so often. So most of the time you'll be on 5.4 or later. If you aren't, you can just go look up what the older syntax is. It's not that difficult. One big warning: declaring variables is completely optional. Now, technically that was the case in JavaScript as well. However, modern JavaScript and modern browsers usually still force you to declare them. And certainly as you're using JavaScript in other more sophisticated ways, and you get into using things like Node.js, it is absolutely going to force you to declare your variables. PHP does not force you to. You can use variables without ever having declared them. And this can lead to some very sticky errors if you're not careful. Basically, if you accidentally misspell a variable name when you're trying to use it, and it doesn't match what it previously matched, PHP cannot catch that error. It simply thinks you're trying to use a new variable. So watch out for that. That's going to get you in trouble eventually. All right, so let's play around with variables just a little bit here. So I'm still back on this same basic page, and in fact we already did quite a bit with a few string variables here. You can see up here near the top of the page I have a little PHP chunk that declares those variables, and then later on in the page I'm outputting those variables. I do it always with a $equals tag, so the little tag that just outputs a value. Let's also do it down here. So you can see variables can be used in a very in-place sort of way. Very often you want to take that data and just immediately output it. So here where we say hello world, let's instead replace that with greeting. And we'll have it say hello client. And so now instead of saying hello world, we want it to say whatever the greeting contains. Well, it just so happens we can actually type that right in line. And the syntax highlighter will recognize what you're doing. This is actually one of the key reasons it wants you to start these with a $sign. So right here, when I have a $sign in here, it recognizes that and it thinks, oh, he's trying to use a variable. And if we save this, you'll notice it replaced that with the contents of the variable $sign greeting. If you actually wanted this to be literally printed out, there is another option. You'll remember I said last time to use double quotes whenever you can. Just like JavaScript, it will support either single quotes or double quotes. In JavaScript, I encouraged you to use single quotes. I do not encourage that in PHP for this specific reason. Let's switch this to using single quotes. And you'll notice it actually behaves differently. Specifically, it does not expand variables at all. It will simply print out literally $sign greeting when you use single quotes. Most of the time, that's actually not what you want. You're pretty used to typing these things in as if they were variables. And that is very much the sort of default when it comes to using PHP. And so that's why I encourage you to default to double quotes. You'll also find when you start putting things in line with the code that having double quotes is a little bit useful. When you have JavaScript that's generated by PHP, sometimes it is, you'll be able to embed the two together a lot easier if you use double quotes on the outside. In addition to this, we can build up a string more dynamically, just like we've done before. So here we've just said greetings from the greeting variable, which was hello client from PHP. Let's do a little bit of math as well. We'll do echo p, and then in the middle of that, we can just do some math. Let's say 2 plus 2 equals 4, of course. But let's say we actually want to compute that. In fact, as long as you're using the echo function, you can send multiple things to it and it will concatenate them together. Now, if we were doing JavaScript, we might like to try and do something like this, where we just compute the 2 plus 2 right in line and add it together. You'll find that doesn't work. If you do that, you're going to wind up with the plus arrow actually evaluating differently. In JavaScript, when you have strings and you add them together, it concatenates them. It makes them into one string. It's not going to do that in PHP. But as long as you're using the echo function, you can in fact just provide multiple things to it, separated by commas. Now what's really going on here is we're calling the function echo with multiple parameters. Think of it as if you called it like a function here with parentheses and passed it multiple parameters. And you can pass it as many as you want, and it basically does concatenation. It concatenates all of those together as strings and shows you the result. Now, interestingly enough, if you call it without the parentheses, it'll work just fine. You'll get the result you expect. But there is one caution. While it behaves like a function and can be written with parentheses like a function, echo is still not quite a function. And in fact, if you try and call it with multiple parameters, you cannot put the parentheses around it. Let's see what happens when we do. When that happens, we finally get generated the infamous 500 error. So here it sent HTTP error 500. And at this point, we have some problems. You can try and inspect and go to the console and see what's going on. And basically, it's just going to say the server responded with a status of 500. The client doesn't really know what went wrong at all, and it can't because the problem happened on the server. Where can we figure out more about it? We can go back to our console where we started grunt. Now, I've actually triggered this error several times already. You'll notice that there's other things here, but in particular, at the most recent line, it says parse error, and then it says the file, and it says exactly where the parse error occurred, line 32. If we come back here to Atom, that is exactly where we were. And this is just a peculiarity of echo. It isn't actually a function, and if you're sending it multiple parameters and not just one, you cannot enclose it in parentheses. One thing that's frustrating about the 500 error is that it also causes browser sync to no longer work. And that's because the page didn't actually load at all. It simply got a 500 response, and so it doesn't even get a chance to inject the browser sync into it. So you have to actually refresh the page after 500 error before you can see for certain that it is working again. So that's what happens when you get a genuine error that's unrecoverable in PHP. It was not able to figure out how to do that. It said there was a parse error on line 32. It couldn't figure out echo. You will find that error listed over on your console where you ran grunt. And so you'll have to go look there. Now, thankfully, that won't happen too often, and when it does happen, you'll be able to respond to it. Most of the errors are recoverable, and it tries to keep moving forward. It will sometimes report errors over here that that were able to be overlooked, and it's been doing that for a while. One thing that I did in my own experimenting was I added in down here a function call. This function call happens at line 38, and it is in fact a mistake. It is a function call that doesn't work. It's a function that doesn't exist, and it's been telling me that over here. On line 37, I have a call to an undefined function, but I didn't even really have to worry about that. It's happening over there. It doesn't really affect me. It's able to render most of the page without it, and it just moves along. This is a recoverable error, and so it just skips that part and keeps delivering the rest of the page. But occasionally it's good to come over here and read exactly what errors are happening. You don't want to leave any errors in there. When you submit something to me, make certain that the error actually does get corrected before you submit it. So almost certainly this error is something that you don't want to be happening. For our purposes, let's go ahead and fix that. We originally wanted it to say author, so let's get it back to that. And now you can see back where it says reloading browsers, this is a new session, and you can see that no errors were generated at that particular time. So this is the basics of working with variables. Let's also take a look at var dump. We can, as we go through this, dump out information about it. So let's say echo p, and then let's say we want to learn about the variable greeting. Let's get in here. Let's say we want to learn about the variable greeting. Again, I'm going to do this with the multi-variable thing. I'm going to say var underscore dump and then $greeting. And we'll just stick it in there in the middle of a p tag. Bring this back up. Let me save this, and you can see it shows us exactly what it was. It is a string with 12 characters, and then it shows the content of that string. Let's try this with a few other variables as well. Let's try, let's create some variables that are just for this purpose. So we'll say x equals true, y equals 2. Again, semicolons are optional. I'm just forgetting to put them. I'm going to put those back in again. Z equals an array. And let's try, well, we need another name now. Q equals an array with some values in it. Let's give it 5, 17, 11, 23, -10. One other one we should do here, this one $R equals 42.7. And do an actual float value too. Let's save all that. Oh, we broke it. How did we break it? Again, I'm saving early here so I can figure out what might be wrong and see what it doesn't like. Parsing error expected a comma or semicolon at line 39. 38, 39. Oh yeah, I was forgetting I didn't have semicolons on those things. So sometimes a semicolon is required there. Okay, so we've done greeting. Let's do $x, $y, $z, and then we also had Q and R. Let's see what all these things look like. $Q and $R. And then we need semicolons at the end of all of these lines. Save all that and see what we got. I got to refresh here because I got the 500 error. There we go. Now we're getting some things. So string 12 for the first one for greeting. That was hello Kylant. Here we have a boolean equal to true. We have an integer equal to 2. Then we have an array with 0 elements, and it tries to show us the elements. And basically, it just goes through and calls var dump for each individual element. And that was Z right there. You know what? Let's put some things in here. We can say If we put this in single quotes here, we can do this a nice way. Let's say $greeting equals like that. And so let's replace each of these with that so we can actually examine them on the page and see exactly what they look like. I mean, get used to the fact that these are all receiving a particular type. So this one's $x, $y, $z, and note I'm switching to single quotes here on purpose because I want to just print the literally $x. I don't want it to interpret that and print the value of the variable. $q, $r, and there we go. That's a little more informative. $greeting equals that. And x is a bool, that's true. And so now let's look at the array here that actually has some things in it. $q is an array with 5 elements, and then it calls var dump on each element. The 0th element is an integer with the value of 5. In fact, I made these all integers. But just like with JavaScript, they don't all have to be the same value. Notice too that it's putting them in curly braces, but it certainly didn't have to. We'd be more used to square braces, but that's just the syntax of var dump. And incidentally, this is the syntax of the older sort of version of arrays if you ever needed to use that. Lastly, here you can see that float is different from int. It isn't just a number. So if it is a floating point value, i.e. it has a fractional part, it's going to store it internally as something completely different, which is different from how, of course, different from the way that JavaScript worked. It always treated numbers the same.